Welcome back to The Breadwinners. I'm Rachael Lowell Ellison. We're talking on this series about how to make work work in a post-pandemic world. How do we stop the burnout and the disengagement and turn things around for ourselves and for our companies? We've talked about psychological safety, about skilling up for the future of work, about measuring impact and adapting flexibly. And today we're talking about how we connect to each other. When I was leading future of work efforts for a big institution, this was the question leaders really wanted to answer. This and where we should work. But this is what leaders really wanted to crack. How do we create community and belonging when we're not sitting all together? They want to do that for so many reasons. It's pretty important. According to an American Psychological Association 2023 Work in America Workforce Survey, 94% of respondents reported that it's somewhat or very important to them that their workplace be somewhere they feel they belong. Finding community at work correlates pretty highly with feeling our best and doing our best work. On the flip side, disconnection can be really harmful. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has called loneliness and isolation an epidemic. And just last week, I think, loneliness was declared a public health emergency in San Mateo County, which is where Silicon Valley is. This is important stuff. And to address it today, I have an incredible guest, Morra Aarons-Mele. Morra is a global speaker, best-selling author of the book The Anxious Achiever, and host of a podcast of the same name that explores the impact of mental health on leadership and the workplace at large. Morra is a successful entrepreneur as well. She and I go back a bit. We spoke about 15 years ago about gender in the workplace and caregiving. And she talked about the importance of building connections then. She said, it's just a fact that women's career progression is going to be interrupted by caregiving at some point. We have different social networks than men. We have fewer access points to power traditionally. I think that one of the best things about the digital age, she said, is that you can be in your home office, in your yoga pants with your kids, and still connect and influence. So that's what we're trying to figure out today. How do we build strong connections from wherever we are for the sake of our well-being and our work? So glad to have Morra back today. Morra, hello. Hello. So good to have you here. I can't even tell you. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you. We're talking about ties. What does it mean to be connected to each other in the workplace? And how do we do that? We know it's important, but how? So before we dive in, there's a question I've been asking each of my experts, and that's how, when you look back on the past few years, let's say the past 4, how has the workplace transformed? And I know that's a huge question, so I'm going to ask you to distill it to a word or phrase and tell us why.
I would say flux.
Yeah.
Change, uncertainty, confusion. I think you and I met many years ago because we were both very active in, I guess, what used to be called the work family or workplace flexibility movement, right? And it was a decades old movement and field of study that really looked at how to make work flexible to accommodate people's whole lives. And I think there was a sense of frustration for so many years among the leaders of this movement, thinking like, we've made all the business cases, the numbers prove us right, we know it's the right thing to do, why won't companies get it? And then all of a sudden the pandemic came, and for a lot of people, especially knowledge workers, like decades of attempted progress happened overnight when people had to go work at home. And I know you've talked to Kelly Yost about this, right? And she's, of course, been making these arguments for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think she's
so,
heading on 30,
yeah,
30 years.
yeah, she's such a visionary.
She is.
So that's amazing, right? Like all this progress happened overnight in a way, but it also created a huge amount of confusion. And now we're sort of cleaning up after the great disruption and trying to figure out what parts of the change to keep, what parts to go sort of quote, go back to, which is really confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think I'd love to hear about your experience with this. I think that there are certainly leaders who would like to just go back, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of, it's easier to bring folks back into the office, quote unquote. That's where collaboration really happens. And one of their concerns, which I wanted to dive into today, is really this question of, it's a very legitimate concern, this feeling of isolation that has developed in these years of flux and uncertainty and remote work, and the need to create belonging and community. And what is so challenging is this idea that we've sort of gotten out of practice at building community in the way that we used to. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would.
Yeah. And I wonder, as we've gone through this time of flux where we've felt this dysregulation is what I've talked about earlier, but this sense of just being off, which I think a lot of people feel, and the rise in mental health issues that have come up, depression, anxiety. What I wonder is, as we think about coming together and creating community, whether it's online or off, do we have the skills? Do leaders have the skills? Have we lost the skills
Well,
to
did
be
they
able
ever
to
have the skills?
Right. There's that question too. What's your thought about that? You are an expert in this space of mental health and working with leaders who are trying to connect and develop the capacity to, for social and emotional intelligence, both for themselves and their organization. So how do you feel, where are we still building that capacity around connection? What are the things that we should be focused on?
That's a big question. I'm trying
It
to,
is a big question.
and of course it varies so widely, right? I think the most interesting thing is I did recently see data, I think it was from Gallup, that I think it was 68% of Americans like their community at work and feel connected at work.
Wow. We'll find that stat. That's
Yeah, for
interesting.
every piece of data that shows that Americans' mental health and how work negatively affects it is decreasing, there's also data that show that Americans are happier than ever at work, which is such an interesting dichotomy. Like, are those the same people? Are they different tribes? Like what's going on there?
Right.
But to me, I think that we all need different things.
Right.
And if the pandemic showed us anything, it's that we bring our whole self to work.
Yeah.
And we work differently. We have different needs. Community means different things, right? Like for every person who was so lonely and so bored and just desperate for people during the pandemic, there was a person who was happy as a clam and relieved and
Yeah.
never wants to go back to work the way they used to. So how do we deal with that? And again, this references Callie's work, So I mean, I think that's really interesting is that we're seeing the rise both of individual expectations, and this is largely generational. There's a lot
Yeah.
of conversation out there about how younger generations simply expect more from work and expect their needs to be met, which is kind of a
Right.
new thing. And also this sense that the pandemic gave a lot of us, the privileged ones of us, of like, how do I want to work? And can I ask for that? And so I feel like one of the big changes that I'm seeing, and again, I work with professionals, I work in a pretty elite sector of work in America. So I need to just state my bias, right?
Sure.
Is that the element of individual choice and happiness is coming up. And it's interesting. I just talked with Kristen Masco, who was the former head of mental health and well-being at Google. And she really talked about this, that she sees sort of the individual against the community and the community interest at work bumping up against each other in a new way.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I've been thinking about that too. Like, how do we sort of, and you hear this from managers, right? Like, so and so
Mm,
wants to work at home, but so and so can't work at home. I want to be fair. I want to be equitable. How do I meet
right.
everyone's needs? Like, there's this new question of like, how do we manage individual desires against the collective?
Managers are in the toughest position
Yeah.
and have been forever, for as long as we've been talking about workplace flexibility, right? It always kind of comes down to how do managers translate this into practice,
Right.
right? It's leaders, but managers have that tactical responsibility as well as the kind of mindset shift that's required, and
Right.
it's mind blowing.
And often they're being asked to make silk out of a sow's ear, right? Like it's
Yeah.
it's really hard. And so I think that we need to be really aware of norms, and we really need to work on buy-in and compromise, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm old, so I can be like, yeah, I want flexibility, but I also know this is work and I
Yeah.
got to
Yeah.
compromise,
That's our
and it's
generation.
it's
Sure.
not all what I want. And that's really true. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Fair. Fair. When we're thinking about, given all these factors, and yes, there are five generations in the workplace, and yes, we're trying to cope with these changing trends and make sense of what's best for the individual and what's best for the organization. And it does sound like trying to all come around to some kind of compromise on what our personal values are and
Well,
what the
buy-in
organization.
on what our
Yeah,
values, right, as a team
right.
are, and then compromise within that and how we sort of tactically work it out.
Yeah. I was talking to Marcella DeCooley about impact a couple episodes ago, about how we look at and measure performance. And one of her greatest points that she brought up in that conversation was the importance of making the implicit explicit,
Mhm.
right? And being able to articulate what are those values, right? Some of that should be the basic foundation of how organization works, but we know that it's not always, right? That we don't really think about what do our core values mean in practice. So, not to pivot entirely, but when we think about workplace well-being and organizational health, given all of these factors, what does that term mean to you, workplace well-being? Like, how would you look at an organization and say they've really addressed this in a meaningful way?
That's such a great question. I've never been asked that question. I mean, well-being is such a tricky word because often to me it sounds like a euphemism, right? Like, what are we really getting
Yeah,
at, right?
yeah,
Is this about the company saving money on insurance? Is this about
right.
culture? Is this about mental health? But I feel that a well organization, or a mentally healthy well organization, is a place where there is a sense of being bought in, where
Mm,
people understand why they show up every day. They
mm-hmm,
basically agree with why they show up. They
mm-hmm,
are happy by and large about what they've been asked to do. They have agency, they have some
mm-hmm,
autonomy in their time, and they're able to make decisions like grown-ups.
mm-hmm,
And there isn't a culture of shame. I mean, maybe a well organization is a psychologically safe organization, but it's also an
mm,
organization that has good pay and benefits, a lot of tactical
right.
things. So I think that when we think of organizations like communities in a way, maybe that's a good framework, like, what does a healthy community look like? You and I live in a
Yeah.
town that is very invested in being a healthy community, right?
Correct. Yes, listeners, we're neighbors
Yes,
ish.
lots
Yeah.
of opinions, lots of like passion, but also a basic buy-in that if I am privileged enough to live in this town, I basically
Hmm.
understand what it stands for, and I
Yeah.
agree with it, right? And I'm going to
Yeah.
support it.
I love that. I love that as a concept to apply to organizations. I think that's so spot on. And it really does tie into the framework we've been talking about this season, the shift, looking at, do we have security, emotional safety, social safety, so we're not encountering bullying and that kind of psychosocial hazards that we sometimes see in the workplace.
I
Do we
mean,
have the financial safety in terms of paid leave and the ability to leave work and get and feed our families at the same time? Sorry, what were you saying?
yeah, I mean, I think about Amazon and I think about, to me, and again, I have no tie to Amazon, but it seems like such an unwell organization from everything I read about it.
Yeah.
And so, right, where you read about people who can't even take a bathroom break, like that.
Yeah, I'm sighing because I actually referenced on an earlier episode of the series someone I know who was talking about the performance management. Essentially, the amount of times your key card flashes on the door at Amazon
Mhm.
is reflected in your performance review.
Oh, God.
Right. So, like, I don't know. It's talk about measuring the wrong thing. It's kind of mind blowing. But
Yeah.
yeah, Amazon is an unhealthy culture for
Right.
sure.
I mean, again, sorry, no shade on Amazon. I don't work
No
there,
shade.
but from what I read. And so, right. And it's funny. I mean, I think also, God, this is so silly, but like the ability to show up on Slack or whatever messaging platform you use and feel comfortable and ask a question, right? And not worry that you're going to be called out, or, there's such basic things that support our mental health and our
Yeah.
well-being at work. And I
Yeah.
really think companies need to think about that as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Tone. I
Hmm.
did a special episode on AI that I recorded yesterday, and
Mm.
listeners will not have heard yet. But, one of the things that Drew Fortin of Lever Talent was talking about was how AI can help us with tonality
Hmm.
and like how we communicate in a virtual space, which was a really interesting idea. Not to dive too deeply into that, but it's interesting to sort of put a pin in that for our conversation.
Oh, yeah.
So you had an amazing conversation. Morra's career, I could go on and on, but it's skyrocketed. It's been so exciting to watch the conversations you've had with these amazing experts and leaders. And you talked to Surgeon General Vivek Murthy about loneliness and belonging. And that's one of the reasons why we could talk about any of these topics here. But I wanted to ask you specifically to tie into ties. So you talked about loneliness and belonging. Let's talk about those concepts a bit as they relate to this idea of individuals and community, work community, right? Collective well-being. So how do we, in your mind, as we think about individual mental health, as we think about all of the things really that we've spoken about in the context of organizations, how do we mitigate loneliness and really play up the belonging factor? And that is a question you should answer in 3 minutes because that's real easy. Give us a couple of thoughts. I know on
Yeah.
your
No, no,
podcast, and
no.
I will link to that. There were some great suggestions and conversations that you had, but I'm curious to hear your kind of thoughts of a couple examples.
Well, first, I would check out the Surgeon General's work on
Report.
loneliness. And he
Mm-hmm.
has an amazing connection challenge, I think it's called, where he provides really simple ways to connect.
The 5 minute.
Yeah. And I could go on and on about Dr. Murthy. I think he's an amazing person. But I think that one of the things that he does so effectively is he uses his own experience. And
Mm-hmm.
that is, in
Correct.
my
Yeah.
experience, the most powerful way in to fostering a sense of belonging on your team if you're a manager,
Yeah.
is that you're curious, you listen, and you're willing to share your own experience. And so one of the ways that we help each other feel less alone, and this is just common sense, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
we tune into someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
We let them know we're there. We help them feel safe if they need to ask us a question.
Mm-hmm.
And that question could be as simple as like, how do I file this expense report? Or it could be, I'm really struggling with this deliverable. Could you help me? Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm having a hard time. I'm feeling not myself. I think I need to take a couple days. Right. So I think that we don't need to overthink this stuff. Right. And the
Mm-hmm.
research backs this up. So,
Sure.
one of the ways that you could foster belonging immediately upon listening to this is you could think of someone who you work with who like you just want to reach out to them. Like maybe they're a little low or maybe they're doing an amazing job and you want to say hi, or maybe you want to get to know them better, right? Maybe they're new and you see them looking a little bit confused sometimes, and just reach out. Just be
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, I'd love to get to know you better. Could we have a virtual coffee or anything? I can go into cliches now, but let's not overcomplicate this.
Yeah.
Really, we can connect. We have that ability within ourselves. And this, if the Surgeon General has shown us anything, it's just we need to be a bit more deliberate about it, a little more
Yeah.
intentional.
I love that. I think that is the key, right? To be able to talk about our own experiences. He talks about on your podcast and in other contexts, really how he has experienced loneliness and depression. For leaders to be able to be vocal about how they're reacting to
Yeah.
the world of work right now is just invaluable. And I think, and this transparency is something that I don't think every generation in the workplace is particularly comfortable with. But I think it's so key. I wonder, just on that topic, something that popped into my mind while you were reflecting was this question of how much is too much to be disclosing at work. So I remember you wrote something years ago, and I'm going to misquote it. And if I do, you correct me, right? But you wrote about what levels of seniority, when should you be candid about mental health and well-being? And for some people at a senior level, there might not be so much of a risk of being that vulnerable. But for folks who aren't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember this article that
Yeah.
I'm talking about? Yeah, for folks who aren't, there's a risk in that. And it's interesting. I was talking to an HR person recently who's at the end of her career, about to retire, and she had two young-ish employees, she didn't tell me their age, come up to her and start talking, specifically starting with their diagnoses,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I have OCD. I need to look at XYZ. I'm not going to recall the exact circumstance, but should we be talking about our diagnoses? Has that changed? You wrote that article, if I'm not mistaken, a couple years ago, no?
Yeah. I mean, this was the whole reason for being of my show, The Anxious Achiever, which is now about to be on its 10th season, was that
Unbelievable.
leaders need to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
leaders have a special responsibility to model change. And the more that we hear leaders talking about difficult issues,
Yep.
the more we feel comfortable. And so I still stand by that, right?
Yeah. Me
But
too.
I also never want to say to anyone, you should do this, because
Mm-hmm.
there are multiple reasons. I mean, look, I understand how ugly and scary mental illness can be.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be something that really can cut down our credibility at work.
Yep.
And so it's really personal. It's also wrapped up in all of the social biases and systems that we live in,
Yep.
right? And so it's personal. But I think that people are bumping up against this in real
Yeah.
time at work, and
Yeah.
they just don't know what to do, right? Like, whoa, you've just unloaded. And I guess it's different if you're in HR because that's kind of your job.
Yeah. Still, though, she was shocked. I mean, the HR person was pretty surprised. She's very open minded, but it was, she didn't expect to hear diagnoses. She comes
But why
from,
not? I mean,
yeah.
because here's the thing. The other purpose of my podcast and my book and my work is this. If you have a brain that's different,
Mm-hmm.
tricky, Like, you do need to work differently. And you probably are amazing. You have superpowers that other people don't have, either through chemistry or through your lived experience, because you've learned because of your brain. Maybe you see things a different way or you can do things a different way, but you have weaknesses. We all have weaknesses that you need to work differently. Like, I learned this very early in my career that I can't work the way other people work. I will end up not functional. But when I'm able to have a little bit more flexibility, I'm pretty damn good at what I do. So
Right.
I'm all about that. Like, if you can say from a position of strength, look, I'm not in crisis right now. I am under treatment. I have a good doctor. I take care of myself, but I have this. And here's what I need. Can we talk about it? A, you're protected under the ADA. And
Yep.
B, why not? Right? Like,
Right.
if you were differently sighted or your hearing was impaired, you would probably let HR know. So I'm like absolutely cool with that.
Right.
But I think there's a time and a place, and I think that there's a way to talk about it. And, younger people, like, we learn. Maybe we haven't
Yeah.
learned that yet, but I encourage people when they want to disclose and ask for something to really come at it. Now, if you're in crisis, that's different. If you're in crisis,
Right.
you need help, and that's okay too. But if you're in treatment and this is a chronic condition and you're like, okay, this is my life, but I'm also willing to show up and do a great job, then it's okay. Like, do it from a position of strength and ability.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I love that. And what it leads me to think, I mentioned the word dysregulated earlier, and not to be too meta, but the way I started this podcast miniseries is talking about how after, and kind of the backstory, but after
Mm.
years and years of chronic stress and transition and crisis, on top of the mental health issues, that diagnoses that I might identify with, my working brain kind of stopped working for me, right? Like, I cite one example. Honestly, it started happening more and more when I wasn't being vocal and attending to my well-being,
Mhm.
which was a blanking out, like
Mm.
blanking in a conversation where I'm talking to deans and heads of department and arguably some of the smartest people in the world.
Mhm.
And one could think, like, look at me and think, in that conversation, I actually remember doing this climate survey feedback with a colleague, and she would just turn to me and ask, like, what do you think about this horrible dysfunction in XYZ organization? And I would just not find the words. And what I learned was that is a manifestation of when your body
Yep.
experiences consistent stressors that you are not processing in a way you're not conscious of. You don't have what they call interoception, right? That idea of being able to read your own body
Mhm.
and focus on it, which I didn't have. I really didn't. I mean, I could tell you if I was anxious, but I couldn't. There were so many different physical symptoms that I wasn't able to identify. And not to go on this tangent about myself, but one of the things that I learned in my research was this question of how do we regulate ourselves? Because I think that because we've all been through some collective chronic stress, there's the question of, can we name our diagnoses? And then can we name this and help each other recenter when we're a little bit off?
Oh God, I love that. I never
Have,
never thought
yeah,
about it like that. Like, how do we help each other regulate, and how do we also know? Because sometimes you don't know when you're dysregulated. To your point,
exactly.
like,
Well,
yeah,
yeah. Have you heard of the window of tolerance? Has that come on your radar at all?
no,
So I'm hoping to get this expert in on polyvagal theory who could probably explain it better than me. But what we, when we think about our ability to stay regulated, and I'll post this image to our show notes, but we can think about it as an open window, right? And so the window, when it's open, our nervous system's in a state of calm. There's all of this polyvagal theory and stuff behind it that I'm not going to go into, but it's a state of calm, it's a state of focus, it's a state of connectedness. I can listen to you, whether I'm a leader or a colleague, without immediate reactivity, with a certain sense of presence, right? And I feel kind of at peace. But what we have when stress and we're not eating right, when we're not exercising, when the world is on fire, when you lose, as we have, a dear person in your life, when you're going through grief, right? You can go one of two ways. So you could go kind of above the window into this hyper aroused state where, and we've all, I think you and I, not to project, but I think we know at least people who've felt this way, this sense of your body goes into fight or flight.
Yep.
And so you have to get shit done.
Yep.
And like the more, I think that's really what I did for 6 or 7 years is just this like, okay, this person's sick. We call this doctor. We do this. We go here. We take this train. We do
executive mode.
Right. You're running.
Yep.
And that kind of feels, just talking to a professional about this last night and I was saying this to her, you can't sustain that indefinitely and expect it not to take a significant toll on your body. But the other side of the window on the bottom is hypoarousal. And that's quiet quitting. And that's just F it. I'm going to binge watch Lessons in Chemistry, right? Which was a great show, by the way. But like what happens, and what I think has happened for most of us, is that the window, we can bounce between those things. When we're in a healthy state, we can kind of smoothly even ourselves back out. And I have a visual of this kind of like a up and down, but not extreme highs and extreme lows. When we are dysregulated, we can bounce from being in executive mode to I'm going to come home and binge watch that show. Or my laundry is sitting all over the table downstairs. I'm not going to touch it, which is a true story. But like we need to find ways through connectedness, through nutrition, through just general self-care and a conversation about what general self-care looks like to keep that window as open as possible. So we're not bouncing, because when we're bouncing, it has the impact on those around us. But like when all of our colleagues, because we're coping with this collective stress, are bouncing between one and the other.
Well, it's contagious too.
Right. So how do we work together to keep the window open? And, companies introduce meditation programs, and there's some great tools that people implement or companies implement to help people regulate their well-being. But what do conversations about that look like? So anyway, that's my window of tolerance rant, but I'm really into it these days because I feel like we live on either side of that window. And I wonder what it would be like for us to talk about our diagnoses and critical conditions, but also to say, how do we all come to a calm and collected place together?
Gosh, you've really gotten me thinking about this. I've been thinking about this because in one of my clients, we've been through a death of our leader, and it was very sudden and it's been really hard. And
awful.
We've been joking with each other about how we react to grief. And so some of us are like, I'm sorry, I'm getting everything done. Like I'm not exactly what we talked about. We're just hyper everything. And that's how I've reacted. And then, we've had some people who've been like, I'm out, I just need some space to be, and I don't know what that looks like. And the key piece that and it's been wonderful to hear leadership say this, is just, let's not judge each other. Let's try to understand that. And this is why I love our friend Rebecca Sofer and her work at Modern Loss. Let's try to understand that we all react to grief differently and there's no right or wrong.
Yeah.
And we've just got to hold space for people. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this is easy to do in crisis. It's very hard in chronic. And I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of organizations are, is that, to your point, you can operate this way for years. And
Mm-hmm.
more than that, the urgency culture of most organizations these days enforces a state of chronic arousal. And a lot of us react to it by just, quote, meeting the occasion, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
anxious achieving. And then eventually we burn out or we crash.
Right.
And so organizations do have a role in asking the hard question of like, is this a chronic problem in my organization?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think they really do. And it's interesting. It's hard, right? Because hyper arousal serves productivity, right? It outwardly, when folks are running around busy and frantic, it's like, well, my team is really working hard right now. And I can be proud of it, right?
Absolutely.
And there is a sense of that. But what's interesting, I think, is, I've had so many conversations when we were talking about strategic flexibility and about where collaboration and innovation happens.
Mhm.
And I think when the windows open and we're feeling that sense of calm and connectedness. And Tara Brach, who I don't know if you've read, but
Of course, yeah.
she has some great quotes about like the connectedness when we connect with each other. That is well-being,
Mhm,
right? That
mhm.
that is what reinforces it. And for some people coming into the office now that they've experienced something else actually dysregulates them and makes it harder for them to innovate and collaborate in the way that they should. I'm just commenting on that. That's not a solution for anyone. But I think, when we think about productivity versus collaboration versus innovation, and I, in my last role, tried to kind of map out what's done best where. And I don't think that I was asked to do that. I don't think we can do that. It was a interesting experiment. I don't think we can do that exactly, but I do think that there needs to be a balance of trying to, with the sort of North Star and the value of keeping people in a connected and innovative place, and recognizing that we're going to go to hyper arousal because there is stress and there are clients and there are deliverables. But how can we try to keep our organization, like we said earlier in the conversation, in a state like to feel like a community
Mhm.
and a place of mutual support and connectedness? And I think that we have a lot to work on in the workplace. So thank God for you that you're doing the work that you're doing to educate us and to bring experts in who are talking about this.
And to you, I mean,
Oh,
I don't think anyone has the answer. And
mm-mm.
again, it's so different and this stuff is so intersectional. And so I just encourage all of us to just try to be curious
Yeah.
and be a little bit patient,
Yeah.
which is for me very difficult, but
Oh, patience is the worst, right? But yeah, patience. Let's be patient. Thank you, Morra, so much.
oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Breadwinners Navigating the Shift. For more information about the model and how to stay ahead in the evolving world of work, make sure to subscribe. You can also look at reworkingleadership.com for more information. You can always find us on the breadwinnerspodcast.com and everywhere podcasts live. If you like what we're up to this season, please leave us a review. It really helps. Or email us at thebreadwinnerspodcast.com. Join us next time as we explore a special topic that's been coming up literally everywhere in the world and on every episode of this mini series. AI. How is it impacting us, our work, and our well being? And how do we leverage it to address everything we've discussed: psychological safety, professional growth, meaning, flexibility, connection. We're going to find out. But until next time, keep connecting and keep healing. It's the new hustling.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.